The world map can change completely within a single human lifetime. In just over a decade, 5 of history's most powerful empires vanished from the earth. This video will give you a clear understanding of how such a staggering transformation was even possible. We are exploring the sudden collapse of 5 great empires. How could dynasties that had lasted for centuries, ruling millions, simply disintegrate one after another? What hidden pressures did they all share? By the end, you will see the direct link between those fallen thrones and the volatile world we live in today. The story begins with a world of emperors and ends with a world of nations. What does it truly take for an age to end? The year was 1910. A single glance at the world map revealed a landscape of almost unimaginable scale, where a handful of names covered vast portions of the earth. These were not mere countries, they were sprawling empires, each a mosaic of languages, faiths, and cultures held together under the crown of a single ruler. In Constantinople, the Ottoman Sultan was both a political leader and the caliph, a spiritual guide for millions across 3 continents. In Vienna, the Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary governed a dizzying array of peoples from the Alps to the Carpathians. To the north, the German Kaiser commanded Europe's most formidable industrial and military machine. In the east, the Russian Tsar ruled from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. And in Beijing, the Qing Emperor presided over a civilization that viewed itself as the very center of the world. From the outside, this order seemed unshakable, eternal. Palaces glittered, armies marched in perfect formation, and steam locomotives now connected ancient capitals, making these empires feel more cohesive and powerful than ever before. The monarchs themselves, whether called Kaiser, Tsar, or Sultan, operated with a certainty that their dynasties were destined to rule for centuries more. Their right was woven into the fabric of history, blessed by tradition and often by divine decree. The sheer bureaucratic weight of these states created an illusion of permanence, a sense that this was simply how the world worked. But if you listened closely, you could hear the deep, structural cracks forming beneath the marble floors and gilded halls. The very technologies that strengthened imperial control, like railways and newspapers, were also spreading new and dangerous ideas. The concept of nationalism, the belief that people who shared a language or culture should govern themselves, was taking root in the provinces and borderlands of every single one of these empires. An ethnic Hungarian, a Polish citizen under the Tsar, or an Arab subject of the Ottoman Sultan was beginning to ask a revolutionary question: why should I be ruled by a distant emperor who does not speak my language or share my dreams? Simultaneously, the brutal shift from farm to factory created sprawling, discontented cities, while new philosophies challenged the very idea of kings and emperors. The stage was set not for gradual evolution, but for a profound and sudden reckoning. The coming storm would not just topple governments, it would shatter the foundational idea of the multi-ethnic empire itself, redrawing the map of the world in a single, turbulent lifetime. To understand the force of that collapse, we must first look at the spark that lit the fuse, an event that began with a single automobile taking a wrong turn. On a cold February morning in 1912, a 6-year-old boy named Pui sat inside the Forbidden City, a vast palace complex in Beijing that had been the seat of Chinese emperors for 5 centuries. Outside its vermilion walls, a new republic was being declared. Inside, a regent knelt before the child and delivered the news: the Qing Dynasty, which had ruled China for 268 years, was over. With a few strokes of a pen on his mother's behalf, little Pui abdicated the dragon throne. In that quiet, almost anticlimactic moment, more than 2,000 years of continuous imperial rule in China came to a close. It was a cultural and political earthquake of unimaginable scale. The Qing Empire, known for centuries as the Celestial Kingdom, had once been the wealthiest and most sophisticated civilization on Earth. By the early 1900s, however, it was a hollow giant. The dynasty was Manchurian, not ethnically Han Chinese, and this distinction had always created a subtle tension with the vast population it ruled. That tension was torn wide open by a series of catastrophic events. The Opium Wars of the mid-19th century were a profound national humiliation, where British gunboats forced China to accept addictive narcotics and surrender key territories. This defeat shattered the myth of imperial invincibility and revealed a technological gap that seemed impossible to close. Desperate attempts at self-strengthening and modernization, like building railroads and modern armies, were too little and too late. They were fiercely opposed by conservative factions within the imperial court who saw any change as a threat to tradition. Then came the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, a violent uprising against foreign influence that was initially supported by the Qing court. When an international coalition crushed the rebellion and occupied Beijing, the dynasty's credibility was destroyed. It was seen by its own people as both too weak to resist foreigners and too foolish to align with them. Into this power vacuum stepped new voices. Nationalist movements, most notably the Tongminghui led by Sun Yat-sen, began advocating not for reforming the empire, but for replacing it entirely with a Chinese republic. Their rallying cry was to overthrow the king and restore sovereignty to the Han people. As historian Jonathan Spence has framed it, this was far more than a simple change of government. It was the collapse of an entire cosmology, a world order where the emperor was the sacred link between heaven and earth. His fall meant the very pillars of society, family, authority, tradition, were suddenly thrown into question. The abdication of Puyi did not bring stability. It unleashed chaos. With the centralizing symbol of the emperor gone, the vast country fractured. Military governors and regional strongmen, known as warlords, seized control of their own territories, leading to decades of brutal conflict. The fall of the Qing dynasty, therefore, was not an end point but a terrifying beginning. It proved that even the most ancient and resilient imperial system could evaporate almost overnight, leaving behind not a new order but a scramble for power. This pattern of collapse creating a vacuum would become a tragic theme, echoing next in the heart of Europe, where an empire began to tear itself apart from within. While a child emperor abdicated in Beijing, a very different kind of pressure was building far to the west, inside the world's largest contiguous empire. The Russian Empire of Tsar Nicholas II was a colossal and brittle structure, a society straining under the weight of its own contradictions. On the surface, it was a realm of unparalleled grandeur, from the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to the onion domes of Moscow. Yet beneath that imperial facade, the lives of millions of peasants and factory workers were defined by profound hardship. The state functioned like a sealed pressure cooker with a rigid class system, a secret police force, and an autocratic ruler who believed his power came directly from God, locking the lid tightly in place. For generations, the heat had been rising. Then, in 1914, Tsar Nicholas made a decision that would turn the internal temperature to its breaking point. He committed Russia to the colossal industrial slaughter of the First World War. The war was an unmitigated disaster. Russian armies, though brave, were poorly led and catastrophically undersupplied. Stories spread of soldiers sent to the front without rifles, told to pick one up from a fallen comrade. Military defeats piled up by the millions. Back home, the economy shattered. Food grew scarce, inflation soared, and in the bitter winter of 1917, long bread lines in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg was then called, became tinderboxes of rage. The pressure cooker was about to explode. In March of that year, a series of strikes and protests over bread shortages swelled into a city-wide uprising. When the Tsar ordered his garrison to restore order, the soldiers, many of them fresh conscripts who shared the people's despair, refused. They joined the protesters. In a matter of days, with stunning speed, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty was finished. Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, not by a foreign army, but by his own starving people and mutinous troops. This was the February Revolution, but the fall of the Tsar did not bring peace or stability. It simply removed the lid from the pressure cooker, allowing a chaotic whirlwind of political forces to erupt into the open. A provisional government made up of liberals and moderates tried to keep Russia in the war and manage a transition to democracy. From the shadows, a more radical group watched and waited. The Bolsheviks, led by the fiercely intelligent and uncompromising Vladimir Lenin, saw their moment. They promised the exhausted, traumatized nation three simple things: peace, land, and bread. It was a message that cut through all complexity. Why continue a losing war? Why let aristocrats own all the farmland? Why let children go hungry? The revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who became the master organizer of the Bolshevik insurrection, later described the fervor of those months with vivid clarity. He wrote of a society where every old truth was being questioned and every established authority was melting into air. In October 1917, Trotsky and Lenin made their move. In a nearly bloodless coup, Bolshevik Red Guards seized key communication and transportation hubs in Petrograd and stormed the Winter Palace, where the weak provisional government was meeting. The October Revolution was complete. The ideological shift was instant and absolute. The new rulers did not seek to reform the empire. They sought to erase it and build a completely new world in its place. They made peace with Germany at a terrible territorial cost, nationalized all private land and industry, and declared the creation of a socialist state. The old empire, with its tsars and orthodoxy and nobility, was declared dead. In its place rose the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The ensuing civil war between the Bolshevik Reds and a scattered coalition of anti-communist whites was one of the most brutal conflicts of the century, a struggle that solidified the new regime's ruthless character. The transformation was total. In less than a single year, Russia had gone from an absolute monarchy to a communist state, an ideological shockwave that would define global politics for the next 70 years. As this radical new power solidified in the East, the shock of its birth began to ripple outward, placing unbearable strain on the ancient empires that bordered it. One in particular found itself caught directly in the path of the coming avalanche. The Russian Revolution was a detonation felt across the continent, but its shockwave traveled along a fuse that was already lit. That fuse was the First World War. To understand how three more empires could vanish in its aftermath, we must see the war for what it truly was, not merely a battle between nations, but the ultimate stress test for the very idea of empire. It was a furnace of unprecedented scale, and the old dynastic structures of Europe were thrown directly into the flames. The statistics alone are almost beyond comprehension. Over 4 long years, more than 16 million individuals lost their lives. The economic cost was similarly staggering, with national treasuries drained and industrial production bent entirely toward the machinery of conflict. But the true fracture was not just in numbers, it was in the social contract. These were multi-ethnic empires, and the war demanded a new, total kind of loyalty. A young Czech peasant in the Austro-Hungarian army, a Senegalese rifleman fighting for France, or an Indian soldier serving Britain in the trenches of Flanders, were all asked to sacrifice everything for a distant sovereign and a cause that often felt abstract. The historian Margaret Macmillan has described the war as a great accelerator. It did not create new historical forces so much as it took existing pressures, nationalism, social inequality, demands for political representation, and amplified them 1,000-fold, speeding everything toward a breaking point. For the autocratic empires still standing in 1918, the war exposed every fatal weakness. Their rigid, top-down governments were ill-suited to the chaotic demands of total war. Inefficiency and corruption hampered supply lines, leading to shortages and hunger on the home front. Military defeats, when they came, were no longer seen as mere setbacks, but as proof of a deep, systemic failure of leadership. The monarchs who had justified their rule by divine right and tradition could offer no compelling answer to the simple, desperate question from their people: why are we suffering like this? The war exhausted their economies, shattered the faith of their subjects, and created a landscape of utter ruin, both physical and spiritual. In that landscape, revolutionary ideas found fertile ground. Soldiers returning from the front were no longer obedient subjects. They were disillusioned veterans armed with modern weapons and a newfound contempt for the old order. The stage was now set for a domino effect. As the war ground to its bloody conclusion, the first empire to topple would pull the others down with it, beginning with the oldest and most vulnerable of them all. The furnace of war finally consumed its first major architect in the autumn of 1918. Germany, the mighty industrial and military engine of the Central Powers, did not fall to a foreign army on its soil, but collapsed from the inside out. For 4 years, the home front had endured the crushing weight of the Allied naval blockade. By 1918, the situation was dire. The official ration for an adult provided barely enough calories for survival, and turnips, once considered livestock feed, became a staple of the human diet. Malnutrition was rampant, especially among children and the elderly. The public spirit, once fiercely united behind the Kaiser, had been ground down by grief and hunger. Then came the final, shattering military news. In late October, the German Naval High Command, in a last, futile act of pride, ordered the fleet at Kiel to sail for a final, suicidal battle against the British Royal Navy. The sailors, who knew the war was lost and saw no point in a meaningless sacrifice, refused. They mutinied, turning their ship's guns on their own officers. This act of defiance at Kiel was the spark. It ignited a firestorm that raced across the country with astonishing speed. Workers' and soldiers' councils, inspired by the recent revolution in Russia, sprang up in every major city. The authority of the state evaporated overnight. In Berlin, the atmosphere was one of surreal tension and exhausted frenzy. As one contemporary journalist described the scene, the streets were a cacophony of shouting crowds, red banners, and the uneasy quiet of abandoned government buildings. The old symbols of power were being literally torn down. Isolated in his military headquarters in Spa, Belgium, Kaiser Wilhelm II received the inevitable news from his own chancellor. The army would no longer fight for him, and the Social Democratic Party leaders in Berlin had given an ultimatum. His abdication was the only hope to prevent a full-blown communist revolution. On November the 9th, with the revolution already claiming the capital, the Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann stepped onto a balcony of the Reichstag building. Seeking to channel the revolutionary energy into a democratic path, he preemptively declared Germany a republic. Just hours later, without ever returning to his homeland, Wilhelm signed the instrument of abdication and fled into exile in the Netherlands. The German Empire, forged by blood and iron only 47 years earlier, had ceased to exist. 2 days later, in a railway carriage in the Campigny forest, German representatives signed the armistice, ending the fighting at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. But peace did not bring unity. The suddenness of the collapse bred a poisonous legend almost immediately. Many within the old military elite and the political right refused to accept that their army had been defeated on the battlefield. Instead, they spread the myth of the stab in the back, the Dolchstoßlegend. This narrative claimed that the undefeated German army had been betrayed by weak politicians, socialists, and Jews on the home front. It was a lie, but a powerful and destructive one. It allowed millions to cling to national pride while rejecting the harsh reality of military failure, and it permanently poisoned the well of the new democracy that rose from the empire's ashes, the fragile Weimar Republic. Born from defeat and revolution, this republic would carry the burden of a shattered economy, a humiliated populace, and the vengeful terms of the Versailles Treaty. Germany's journey from imperial monarchy to unstable democracy was not a clean transition, but a traumatic rupture, one that left deep fissures in its political landscape, fissures that would one day be pried open with catastrophic consequences. And as Germany convulsed, the shockwaves rippled southeast, toppling an empire that was already a patchwork of nations straining at the seams. The German Empire's collapse was a political explosion, but the disintegration to its southeast was something more profound, a quiet dissolution. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that ancient and bewildering mosaic of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, and Italians, did not fall with a single dramatic crash. It simply ceased to be, melting away like a patch of winter snow in a sudden spring thaw. The man at the center of this vanishing act was a young, well-intentioned emperor who inherited a throne already crumbling beneath him. Karl I, the last Habsburg ruler, came to power in 1916 amidst the despair of war. By November 11, 1918, the same day the guns fell silent in the west, he found himself in the Schönbrunn Palace, faced with an impossible reality. His armies had dissolved, his cities were in the hands of national councils, and his empire existed only on paper. In a moment of poignant ambiguity, he signed a proclamation. It carefully stated that he was relinquishing participation in the affairs of state. He did not use the word abdication. It was as if he could not bring himself to formally end a dynasty that had ruled Central Europe for over 6 centuries. He simply acknowledged that the empire was already gone. This was not a failure of character, but the inevitable result of a fatal design flaw. The dual monarchy was a grand 19th century compromise, an attempt to manage nationalist fervor by giving Hungary near equal status with Austria. But it only addressed the demands of 2 dominant groups, leaving a dozen other nationalities feeling like second-class citizens in their own homelands. The war acted as a terrible catalyst. As historian Timothy Snyder has described, the conflict became a factory of new national consciousness. A Czech soldier, ordered to fight for a German emperor against his Slavic Russian cousins, began to question his loyalty. A Polish peasant conscripted into the Austrian army dreamed of a unified Poland that included his homeland. The empire's great diversity, once its strength, became its Achilles heel. The central authority in Vienna, weakened by military defeat and economic collapse, could no longer hold the center. What followed in the autumn of 1918 was, in Snyder's evocative phrase, a true springtime of nations. It happened with breathtaking speed and a strange lack of violence against the old regime. One by one, the pieces of the mosaic declared their independence, not through revolution, but through declaration. On October 28 in Prague, the Czechoslovak National Committee simply took over the administration. The Austrian garrison, confused and leaderless, offered no resistance. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, a philosopher who had spent the war lobbying the Allies abroad, returned as the president of a country that had not existed on any map a month before. In the south, the South Slavs, Croats, Slovenes, Serbs proclaimed the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later known as Yugoslavia, pledging allegiance to the Serbian king in Belgrade. Budapest declared Hungary an independent republic. Even German Austria, the empire's core, declared itself a republic, a small, bewildered state unsure of its own future. The Habsburg civil service, famously efficient and loyal, often simply stayed at their desks, now working for new national governments. The empire did not explode, it dematerialized. The consequence was a complete reconfiguration of Central Europe. Overnight, the great, colorful patchwork of the Habsburg lands was replaced by a new map of nation-states, each founded on the principle of ethnic self-determination. This was the dream of Woodrow Wilson made real, but the reality was infinitely messy. The new borders were jagged and contentious, leaving millions of ethnic minorities stranded on the wrong side of new lines. A German-speaking shopkeeper might find himself in Czechoslovakia, a Hungarian farmer in Romania, a Ukrainian village in Poland. The stability once enforced by a distant emperor in Vienna was gone, replaced by a volatile patchwork of young, insecure nations, many with grievances against their neighbors. The peaceful evaporation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, therefore, did not create peace. It created a fragile new order, a powder keg of national ambitions and minority resentments that would define the coming decades. And as this ancient European power faded into history, all eyes turned to the one remaining great empire, a colossus that had entered the war on the winning side, yet found itself more vulnerable than ever. While empires dissolved peacefully or collapsed inward, the final act for the oldest of them was a protracted and agonizing struggle. The Ottoman Empire, long labeled the sick man of Europe, was like a vast, ancient tree, its trunk hollowed by centuries of decay. When it finally fell, the impact shattered the ground, and from its broken branches, new nations fought to take root. Its end was not a single event, but a savage decade-long unraveling. The decline had been a long slope, but the final plunge began with military catastrophe. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were a shocking humiliation, where the empire lost nearly all its remaining European territories to a coalition of small, newly independent states. The defeat revealed a stark truth to the world and to the empire's own subjects. The Ottoman military was no longer a match for its neighbors. This vulnerability made the empire a target, and when the First World War erupted, its leaders made a fateful gamble, aligning with Germany. The decision proved disastrous. The campaign in the Caucasus against Russia ended in a frozen nightmare for the Ottoman army. Then came the Allied assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula in 1915, a brutal 9-month battle that, while an Ottoman defensive victory, bled the empire of an entire generation of its best young men. The human and economic cost of total war was more than the fragile structure could bear. As the war ended in defeat, the victorious Allies moved to dismember the corps. British, French, Italian, and Greek forces occupied large portions of the empire's heartland. In 1920, the Treaty of Sevres was imposed, a document so harsh it planned to carve up Anatolia itself, leaving only a small rump state around Ankara under Ottoman control. Constantinople, the magnificent capital for nearly 5 centuries, was occupied by foreign troops. The Sultan, now a prisoner in his own palace, seemed prepared to accept this national death sentence. But in the rugged interior of Anatolia, a different spirit was coalescing. A military commander named Mustafa Kemal, who had distinguished himself at Gallipoli, refused to accept the partition of the Turkish homeland. He rallied remnants of the army, provincial leaders, and a populace burning with nationalist fury. From Ankara, he and the newly formed Turkish Grand National Assembly declared a simple, revolutionary principle: sovereignty belongs unconditionally to the nation. In a fiery speech, Mustafa Kemal framed the struggle not as saving an empire, but as birthing a nation. He declared that the Turkish people had the right to live as an independent, free, and respectable nation. This was a war of liberation fought on 2 fronts, against the occupying Allied powers and against the Sultan's government in Constantinople, which condemned the nationalist movement. The most intense conflict was the Greco-Turkish War, a 3-year campaign following Greece's invasion of Western Anatolia with Allied encouragement. It was a war marked by immense hardship and profound civilian suffering on both sides. By September 1922, the Turkish nationalist forces had achieved a stunning military victory, driving the Greek army into the sea. This triumph changed everything. That November, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara passed a resolution that severed the final tie to the past. It abolished the Ottoman Sultanate, separating the centuries-old institution of political power from the religious role of the Caliph. Sultan Mehmed VI fled Constantinople on a British warship. The empire was legally extinct. The final diplomatic recognition came with the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, which replaced the punitive Treaty of Sevres. It established the modern borders of Turkey and secured international sovereignty for the new state. The man who led this fight, now known as Atatürk, or Father of the Turks, then embarked on one of history's most radical projects of self-reinvention. He transformed the remnant of a theocratic, multi-ethnic empire into a secular, homogeneous nation-state. He replaced the Arabic script with a Latin alphabet, granted women unprecedented rights, and abolished the caliphate itself in 1924, cutting the last link to the imperial and religious past. The Ottoman Empire did not fade quietly. It was dismantled through war, rebellion, and a fierce, defiant act of will. Its end was brutal, but from its ashes rose a completely new kind of political entity, a modern republic forged in the crucible of total collapse. With the last great empire gone, the world map was utterly unrecognizable. But the story does not end with empty thrones and new borders. The true legacy of this great vanishing was the volatile and dangerous world it left behind. The map was redrawn, but the deeper change was in the minds of millions. Across the ruins of those 5 empires, a single, unstoppable idea had proven more powerful than any army: the idea of the nation. This was the common thread that unraveled every imperial tapestry. For centuries, dynastic loyalty had been the glue of these vast realms. People swore allegiance to a crown, a faith, or a royal family, not to an abstract concept of shared ethnicity or language. But the 19th century gave birth to a new kind of political imagination. Thinkers and writers began to argue that a people who shared a language, a history, and a culture constituted a natural political unit, deserving of its own sovereign state. This was nationalism, and it spread like a virus through the interconnected world of railroads and telegraphs, finding a receptive host in every corner of every empire. The historian Benedict Anderson famously called nations imagined communities, because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, yet in their minds lives the image of their communion. This act of imagination was revolutionary. A Czech journalist in Prague, a Polish poet in Warsaw, and an Arab intellectual in Damascus could all begin to imagine a homeland that existed not on any current map, but in a shared future. They published newspapers and books in their vernacular languages, reviving folk tales and histories that predated the emperors. These cultural projects created a powerful sense of us, distinct from them, the distant imperial rulers in Vienna, St. Petersburg, or Constantinople. When the supreme test of World War came, this ideological solvent ate through the remaining bonds of imperial loyalty. The war demanded total sacrifice for the emperor's cause, but it also gathered diverse ethnic groups together in the trenches, where they compared notes and grievances. Why, a Ukrainian conscript might wonder, am I dying for a Russian Tsar who suppresses my language? Why should an Armenian soldier fight for an Ottoman sultan whose government views him with suspicion? The empires, in their desperation, had armed their own gravediggers. Within each crumbling state, nationalist movements seized the moment with precise calculation. In the Ottoman Empire, the Young Turks had initially sought to save the empire through modernization and a unifying Ottoman patriotism, but military disaster pushed them toward a more exclusive Turkish nationalism, a shift that had tragic consequences for minority groups. In Austria-Hungary, Czech and Slovak leaders like Tomáš Masaryk brilliantly lobbied the Allied powers abroad. arguing that an independent Czechoslovakia would be a democratic bulwark against German expansion, turning their national dream into a strategic asset for the victors. Polish nationalists played all sides, raising legions that fought for both the Central Powers and the Allies, with the sole aim of appearing at the peace table as a nation that had earned its statehood. This ideological shift was the fundamental driver of disintegration. The multi-ethnic empire, which had managed diversity through hierarchy and dynastic authority, had no answer for the passionate, modern question, why should we be ruled by someone else? Nationalism provided the answer and the moral energy to break those ancient bonds, yet for all its power to create, nationalism carried a dangerous double edge. The same fervor that built cohesive new states like Czechoslovakia or Turkey also drew borders that left millions of ethnic minorities stranded, nurturing resentments that would fuel future conflict. The principle of self-determination, so beautifully simple on paper, proved agonizingly messy on the ground. If nationalism dissolved the empires, what force would contain the ambitions of the new nations it created? The answer would emerge from the very peace meant to settle their fate, a settlement so flawed it guaranteed the next great catastrophe. The sheer cost of maintaining an empire became its heaviest burden. While nationalism provided the ideological spark, it was economic strain that turned imperial structures into tinder, ready to ignite. Each of these 5 empires, in its own way, faced a similar crisis. They were 19th-century institutions trying to survive in a 20th-century world without fundamentally changing who benefited from their wealth. The pressure came from every direction. First, there was the astronomical expense of simply keeping up. Modern armies required steel battleships, rapid-firing artillery, and millions of uniforms. Building railroads to move troops and bind territories together consumed mountains of capital. To pay for it all, governments borrowed heavily on international markets, often pledging future tax revenues as collateral. The Ottoman Empire's situation was particularly stark. By the 1880s, it was so deeply in debt to European banks that an international council, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, was established to directly collect certain taxes and manage repayments. For the Sultan's subjects, this was a daily, humiliating reminder that their sovereignty was compromised, that foreign creditors held a direct claim on the fruits of their labor. This fiscal vise tightened the social contract to a breaking point. When taxes rose to service these debts, but living standards did not improve, the question from the peasant and the shopkeeper became more urgent. What are we paying for? The answer, increasingly, seemed to be for the grandeur of a distant court and the interest payments to London or Paris bankers. Simultaneously, the global economic landscape was shifting beneath their feet. For centuries, China's Qing dynasty had operated within a silver-based system, where its exports of tea, porcelain, and silk created a massive trade surplus, drawing silver into the country. But the 19th century opium wars forcibly reversed this flow. Britain demanded payment for the opium it imported into China, and later for war indemnities, draining China of its silver reserves and triggering severe inflation and economic chaos at the local level. The imperial government's inability to control its own monetary stability was a fatal blow to its legitimacy. In Russia, the state pursued a different, equally disruptive path: forced industrialization. To compete with Western powers, the Tsarist regime pushed for rapid industrial growth in the late 19th century, financing massive factories and railroads. The human cost was immense. Millions of peasants flocked to cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, where they found grueling working conditions, overcrowded slums, and a profound sense of dislocation. This new urban proletariat, concentrated and miserable, became a fertile ground for revolutionary ideas. They were no longer tied to the land or to traditional loyalties. Their hardship was directly linked to the state's modernizing project. Here, technology played a double role. The very railroads and telegraph lines that allowed empires to project power also carried new ideas and connected disaffected groups. A strike in a factory could now be reported across the country in hours, inspiring solidarity. More critically, these technologies made the failures of the state more visible and immediate. News of a military defeat or a bread shortage in the capital could no longer be contained or softened by time and distance. It spread instantly, fueling panic and anger. This was the volatile mixture that awaited the ultimate stress test: total war. The First World War did not create these economic weaknesses. It exposed and accelerated them to a catastrophic degree. The war demanded everything. It conscripted farmers, crippled international trade, and diverted all production toward destruction. In Germany, the British naval blockade created a famine on the home front, where the diet of turnips and hunger became known as the turnip winter. In Russia, the strain was even more direct. The decision to keep printing money to fund the war effort led to hyperinflation. By the winter of 1917, the ruble was nearly worthless. In Petrograd, long lines for bread formed in the freezing dark, and when the bakeries ran empty, the despair turned to rage. These were not random acts of protest. They were the logical endpoint of a broken economic promise. The empires had asked for total sacrifice but could not provide basic sustenance. The social contract, already frayed, was now torn to pieces. When the ruler can no longer guarantee security or bread, the ruled have little reason to remain loyal. The economic pressures of modernization, debt, and industrial change created deep fault lines in every imperial society. The earthquake of World War then struck along those exact lines, guaranteeing the collapse would be structural and total. Yet, even as the ground gave way, the men on the thrones clung to one final, desperate source of authority, a force that would ultimately abandon them when they needed it most. The final thread that bound these 5 collapses was not a force of nature, but a human failure of imagination. Each empire was ultimately steered toward the rocks by a captain who could not or would not change course. The last emperors Pui, Nicholas II, Wilhelm II, Karl I, and Mehmed VI were not identical men, but they were prisoners of identical systems. They were the living symbols of institutions that had grown too rigid, too insulated, and too convinced of their own eternal right to rule, to even comprehend the scale of the storm around them. Picture a grand ocean liner, its hull already groaning under the strain, heading directly for an iceberg. The officers on the bridge have all the information they need from the lookouts, the charts warn of danger, and the crew begs for a turn of the wheel. Yet the captain, bound by tradition and a sacred belief in the ship's unsinkable design, refuses to alter course by a single degree. This is the essence of what historian Barbara Tuchman called wooden-headedness. She defined it as assessing a situation in terms of preconceived fixed notions while ignoring or rejecting any contrary signs. It is acting according to wish while not allowing oneself to be deflected by the facts. This wooden-headed leadership was the fatal flaw in every imperial court. For the child Emperor Pui, the decision was not his own, but made by a regent and a court of Manchu nobles who clung to centuries of ritual even as the Republicans stormed the gates. Their fixed notion was that the mandate of heaven could not truly be revoked, that the sheer weight of tradition would prevail. They ignored the facts of mass discontent, modern armies, and a nation that had lost all faith in them. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II was the textbook example. His fixed notion was autocracy, a belief that his power came from God and that to share it, even to save his throne, would be a sin against his sacred oath. He dismissed the First Duma, or parliament, almost as soon as it was created. He ignored the desperate memos from his own ministers warning of social explosion. He retreated into the isolation of his family, treating the governance of 130 million people as a private, dynastic matter. Even as revolutionaries flooded the streets, He wrote in his diary about the weather and quiet family dinners, a stunning disconnect from reality. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany presented a different face, one of bluster and modern militarism, but his wooden-headedness was just as profound. His fixed notion was the supremacy of the German military machine and his own divine right to wield it. He surrounded himself with sycophantic generals and dismissed civilian politicians as weak. He believed a short, glorious war would unite the nation and cement his legacy, ignoring the intricate web of European alliances and the industrial nature of modern conflict that guaranteed a long, grinding slaughter. His refusal to seek a negotiated peace when the war turned, his insistence on fantastical war aims, bled his nation white. For Karl I of Austria-Hungary, the rigidity was not personal ambition but institutional paralysis. He inherited a state so bureaucratically complex, so bound by ancient compromises between its German and Hungarian halves, that meaningful reform was almost impossible. His fixed notion was the sanctity of the Habsburg dynasty itself. He made secret, desperate attempts to negotiate a separate peace during the war, but he could never publicly break from his German ally or truly offer federal rights to his empire's Slavs, because doing so would have acknowledged that the dynasty was no longer the central, unifying force. He was a decent man trying to steer a ship whose steering mechanism had rusted solid decades earlier. Finally, Sultan Mehmed VI in Constantinople was a ruler trapped by the very symbol of his power. His fixed notion was the survival of the Ottoman dynasty, even if it meant accepting the role of a puppet under Allied occupation. While Mustafa Kemal was rallying a national resistance in Anatolia, the Sultan in his occupied palace condemned the nationalists as rebels, choosing the illusion of imperial continuity under foreign control over the messy, violent birth of a Turkish nation. In each case, the institution protected the leader from reality. Elaborate court rituals, layers of obsequious ministers, and the ideology of divine right created a feedback loop that filtered out bad news and amplified assurances of loyalty. How do you tell a king he is failing when his very identity is built on being infallible? The systems were designed for stability, not adaptation. They could suppress rebellion, but they could not learn from it. They could build palaces, but they could not build trust. This shared inflexibility turned what might have been periods of difficult reform and renewal into death spirals. A manageable crisis of representation becomes a revolution. A military setback becomes a collapse of the state. When power is entirely divorced from accountability, when a leader's primary duty is to a legacy rather than to the living people he governs, the course is set for the iceberg. The ship may be majestic, but it is doomed, and as these great vessels slipped beneath the waves, they left behind not calm waters, but a turbulent sea of new and fragile states, all trying to navigate without any charts at all. But nationalism alone was not the only new idea in the air. As the old dynastic certainties crumbled, people did not just want new rulers, they wanted entirely new rules. A marketplace of radical ideologies opened, each offering a complete blueprint for how society should be rebuilt from the ashes of empire. These were not just plans for a new government, but visions for a new humanity, and they proved irresistibly compelling to those who had lost everything. Picture a Russian soldier in the frozen trenches of the Eastern Front in 1917, his uniform in tatters, his hope gone. Into his hand slips a crudely printed pamphlet. It does not speak of God or Tsar, but of class and exploitation. It tells him the war is not for Mother Russia, but for the profits of bankers and factory owners. It promises that if he and his comrades turn their guns the other way, they can seize the land, the factories, and the peace they so desperately crave. This was the power of Bolshevism, a militant branch of socialism shaped by Vladimir Lenin. It masterfully redirected the vague anger of the masses into a specific revolutionary program. Its promise was not just political change, but total social and economic transformation, the abolition of private property and the creation of a worker state. The Russian Empire did not just fall, it was consciously dismantled and replaced by a daring, terrifying experiment, the world's first communist state. This was a model that explicitly rejected everything the old empire stood for: monarchy, religion, capitalism, and it would inspire and frighten the world for decades to come. On the other side of the continent, a different revolutionary blueprint was taking shape. In China, the intellectual Sun Yat-sen formulated the three principles of the people, a guiding philosophy for the new republic. These principles were nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihood. For Chinese students and reformers who had witnessed their ancient empire humiliated by foreign powers, this was a powerful triad. Nationalism meant reclaiming Chinese sovereignty and spirit. Democracy meant replacing the divine right of emperors with the will of the people. The people's livelihood was a commitment to social welfare and economic justice. This was a republican vision, one that sought to leap from a feudal imperial system directly into a modern constitutional state. It offered a clear and dignified path forward, a way to be both proudly Chinese and thoroughly modern, without the burden of a distant, obsolete throne. And in the heart of the former Ottoman lands, yet another model emerged, one of fierce secular nationalism. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's revolution was not about class struggle like in Russia, nor was it a broad republican democracy like the early Chinese vision. It was a surgical, top-down project of cultural and political engineering aimed at creating a homogeneous, modern nation-state. Atatürk's ideology, known as Kemalism, explicitly rejected the empire's theocratic foundation. He abolished the centuries-old caliphate, separated religion from the state, replaced the Arabic script with a Latin alphabet, and granted women unprecedented legal rights. His goal was to forge a new Turkish identity, one oriented toward Europe and science, not toward the Ottoman past and Islamic law. This was a revolution of lifestyle and mindset, a deliberate erasure of imperial identity to ensure its survival was impossible. These ideologies, communism, republicanism, secular nationalism, were more than political platforms. They were comprehensive belief systems that filled the spiritual void left by the departure of kings and sultans. They gave people a new sense of purpose and belonging, a new story about who they were and what their society could become. They promised progress, equality, and a sovereignty that came from the people themselves, not from a crown or a holy text. The collapse of the five empires, therefore, was not an ending. It was the starting gun for the 20th century's great ideological races, a competition to define the future that would play out on a global scale. Yet, as these new models rose, the peacemakers gathering to formally end the war faced an impossible task: how to draw stable borders on a map that was still molten with change. The peace treaties were signed, but peace itself did not arrive. The world in 1919 was a vast, smoking crater where 5 imperial structures had stood, and into that crater poured a chaotic scramble of millions of lives, armies, and ambitions. The collapse was not an event with a clear conclusion. It was a process, a violent and messy birth. The first and most immediate consequence was a human tide of displacement. As new borders were etched onto maps in distant conference rooms, they cut directly through towns, farms, and hearts. Overnight, a Greek family living for generations on the coast of Anatolia could find themselves inside the new Turkish Republic. A German-speaking community in the Sudetenland was now citizens of Czechoslovakia. These were not abstract lines, they were existential crises. Historian Margaret Macmillan, in her study of the Paris Peace Conference, captures the surreal disconnect. She writes of diplomats like Britain's Lloyd George and Francis George's Clemenceau, arguing over territories they had never seen, making decisions based on outdated maps and political trade-offs, while on the ground, the reality was one of profound confusion and fear. The result was a colossal refugee crisis. Millions were uprooted, fleeing violence or political persecution, or simply trying to reunite with their new nation-state. It was one of the greatest forced migrations in human history, a silent, suffering counterpoint to the triumphant declarations of independence. In many places, the vacuum of imperial power ignited brutal civil wars, proving that removing a central authority often unleashes the very forces it had contained. The most devastating was the Russian Civil War, a multi-sided conflict that raged from 1918 to 1922. It was not a simple fight between Reds and Whites. It was a chaotic melee involving the Bolshevik Red Army, various anti-communist White forces, nationalist movements in Ukraine and the Caucasus, and even foreign interventionists from Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, all hoping to shape Russia's future. The human cost was catastrophic, exceeding that of the World War for Russia through combat, famine, and disease. The conflict cemented the Bolsheviks' ruthless control and created a siege mentality that would define the Soviet state for decades. Similarly, the birth of modern Turkey was not granted by treaty, but seized in the Turkish War of Independence. Mustafa Kemal's nationalist forces fought not only the occupying Greek army, but also Armenian forces in the east and French and Italian contingents, in a desperate struggle to prevent the partition of Anatolia envisioned by the Treaty of Sevres. This war reshaped the entire Near East, leading to a massive, traumatic population exchange between Greece and Turkey, formally displacing over 1 million people to homogenize the new national borders. Meanwhile, in the heart of Europe, new states trembled on shaky foundations. The Weimar Republic in Germany was born under a curse, burdened by the war guilt clause and colossal reparations of the Versailles Treaty, which fueled a narrative of betrayal and humiliation. Its economy, battered by war and now by debt, would soon spiral into hyperinflation, destroying the savings of the middle class and creating a fertile ground for extremism. To the east, the patchwork of new nations Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the Baltic states were fragile creations. Each contained simmering ethnic minorities who felt alienated or oppressed by the new majority rule. Poland and Czechoslovakia clashed over the industrial region of Teschen. Yugoslavia was a tense union of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes with very different historical experiences. These states were democratic in name, but many quickly slid toward authoritarianism, as their leaders, fearing internal disintegration and external threats, prioritized security over liberty. The diplomat and historian George F. Kennan would later call this post-war constellation the great unsolved problem of Eastern Europe, a volatile region where the principle of national self-determination had created as many problems as it solved. The conferences of Paris and Sevres did not build a stable new world order. They drafted a blueprint for one, but left the construction site littered with dynamite. The collapse of empire, therefore, was merely the first tremor in a long seismic event. The true legacy was not the clean map of nation-states the peacemakers imagined, but a landscape of unresolved grievances, wounded pride, and ideological fervor, a landscape where the next, even more catastrophic storm was already gathering its clouds. The ink on the Treaty of Versailles was still wet when its poison began to seep into the soil of Europe. For the defeated, the treaty was not a foundation for peace, but a monument to humiliation, a document that guaranteed the coming storm would be even more terrible. The most toxic seed was planted in Germany, a nation already reeling from the shock of sudden collapse. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. This was not just a legal formality, it was a psychological wound, a national stigma that would be relentlessly picked at for decades. Combined with this was a reparations bill so vast it was almost abstract, initially set at 132 billion gold marks, a sum designed to cripple the German economy for generations. For a proud people who believed their army had been undefeated in the field, this was an unbearable insult. In a crowded military hospital in the autumn of 1918, a young, embittered army corporal named Adolf Hitler learned of Germany's surrender. He described the moment as if the world went black. This profound sense of betrayal, of a nation stabbed in the back by weak politicians and sinister forces, became the core myth that would propel him to power. The peace settlement did not create a stable democracy in Germany. It created a resentful, volatile state where extremist voices found a ready audience. But the resentment was not confined to Berlin. The Ottoman Empire, though it fought on the losing side, was dismantled with even greater severity by the Treaty of Sevres. Its proposed partition was so complete it seemed to erase the Turkish homeland from the map. While Mustafa Kemal's War of Independence ultimately overturned this draconian settlement, the initial humiliation fueled a fierce, defensive nationalism that defined the new Turkish Republic. The experience taught a brutal lesson that in this new world of nations, survival depended on uncompromising strength and ethnic cohesion, a lesson other movements would observe and emulate. Meanwhile, the peaceful dissolution of Austria-Hungary created a different kind of problem, a power vacuum filled by a fragile patchwork of new states. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were noble experiments, multinational states trying to forge unity from diversity, but they were inherently unstable. Yugoslavia, a kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, was tense with internal rivalries from the start. The Serbian-dominated government in Belgrade often failed to address the distinct aspirations of Croats and Slovenes, fostering a resentment that would simmer for 70 years before boiling over into catastrophic violence. Eastern Europe became a checkerboard of minority grievances, where ethnic Germans in Poland or Hungarians in Romania felt like second-class citizens in their new nations. These were not just border disputes, they were ticking time bombs left over from the imperial collapse. The great unraveling of empires, therefore, did not lead to a lasting peace. It led to the interwar period, a 20-year truce defined by economic crisis, weak democracies, and smoldering national hatreds. The League of Nations, the new international body created to manage this world of nations, proved utterly incapable of containing these forces. When the global economy collapsed in 1929, the fragile structures built in 1919 collapsed with it. The unresolved legacy of imperial collapse, the humiliations, the unstable borders, the bitter ethnic divisions provided the perfect fuel for a new, virulent ideology. Fascism and Nazism did not emerge from a vacuum. They grew directly in the soil of resentment and chaos left behind by the vanished empires, offering simple, violent solutions to the complex problems the peacemakers had failed to solve. The fault line opened by the Romanov Empire's collapse did not just split Russia, it cracked the world in two. From the ashes of that autocracy rose a superpower with a revolutionary mission, one that would define the entire geopolitical landscape for the next 7 decades. The birth of the Soviet Union was not merely a change of government in Moscow. It was the introduction of a radical new player onto the global stage, one whose very existence challenged every assumption of the old imperial order. This created an immediate and terrifying power vacuum in Eastern Europe, a region suddenly stripped of its traditional rulers. Into this space, the ideological battle between communism and capitalism rushed, hardening into the defining conflict of the age, the Cold War. Historian John Lewis Gaddis, in his work on the Cold War's origins, frames this period not as a simple rivalry between nations, but as a clash between two universal ideologies, each claiming to represent the future of humanity. The Bolshevik success in Russia proved that a modern state could be built on the principles of Marx and Lenin, and that proof sent a shockwave of fear through the capitals of the West. The fear was not of a traditional empire seeking territory, but of an ideological virus, one that promised to spread revolution to the exhausted working classes of Europe and beyond. This fear shaped Western policy from the very beginning. We can see it in the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War, where foreign troops landed on Soviet soil in a failed attempt to strangle the revolution in its cradle. We see it in the diplomatic isolation of the Soviet Union throughout the 1920s and 30s, treated as a pariah state, and most profoundly, we see it in the post-World War II division of Europe itself. When Nazi Germany was finally defeated, the Soviet Red Army did not retreat to its pre-war borders. It remained, occupying the nations of Eastern Europe that had once been part of the Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires. For Stalin and his successors, this was not just a security buffer, it was the logical extension of their revolutionary ideology, a way to ensure that the power vacuum left by the Third Reich was filled by communist states loyal to Moscow. From Warsaw to Sofia, capitals fell under this new sphere of influence. The Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill famously described was, in a very real sense, drawn along the exact contours of that earlier imperial collapse. The world became bipolar, split into two armed camps, because one pole was occupied by a state that simply would not have existed without the total disintegration of the Tsarist regime. Every proxy war, from Korea to Vietnam to Angola, every nuclear standoff, every spy scandal, and every moment of existential dread during the 20th century can trace a line back to that winter in Petrograd when the old empire fell and a terrifying new experiment began. The Cold War was the long, global aftershock of a single empire's sudden demise. The news from Petrograd and Constantinople did not stay in Europe. It traveled by steamship and telegraph wire to Bombay, to Cairo, to Dakar, carried in newspapers read by lawyers, students, and shopkeepers living under a different kind of imperial rule. For an Indian nationalist like Jawaharlal Nehru, learning of the Tsar's fall was a thunderclap of possibility. If a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries could be swept away by its own people, what did that mean for the British Raj? The collapse of those 5 continental empires did more than redraw maps. It shattered something intangible but essential, the myth of imperial invincibility. For centuries, European power in its colonies was maintained not just by guns and ships, but by a carefully cultivated aura of permanence and inherent superiority, an unshakable prestige. The sight of emperors and sultans, figures who seemed as solid as mountains, being toppled by ordinary citizens and nationalist movements, cracked that aura wide open. It proved that empires were not eternal, they were human constructions and they could be dismantled. This psychological shift was electrifying. Colonized intellectuals began to apply the same principles that had dismantled Europe to their own situations. When American President Woodrow Wilson spoke of self-determination during the peace negotiations, declaring it an imperative principle, his intended audience was the peoples of the fallen Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. But in lecture halls from Delhi to Accra, his words were heard differently. They were seized upon as a universal right. If Poles and Czechs deserved their own nations, why not Indians or Nigerians? The argument was simple, powerful, and impossible for the colonial powers to refute without glaring hypocrisy. The intellectual framework used to break apart the land-based empires of Europe became the very blueprint for challenging their overseas colonial empires. The Indian National Congress, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru, explicitly linked their struggle to this new global mood. They pointed to the fallen thrones as evidence that the age of empire was ending and that India's time for sovereignty had come. The connection was not merely philosophical, it was personal and strategic. Many future leaders of decolonization were directly shaped by witnessing this great unraveling. Leopold Senghor, who would become the first president of Senegal, was a student in Paris in the 1920s, immersed in the intellectual ferment that followed the war. He saw firsthand how the old European order had fractured, and it deeply informed his vision for a post-colonial African identity that was modern and self-determined. The collapse created a domino effect of ideology. The success of Mustafa Kemal in forging a strong, modern Turkey from an empire's core inspired nationalists across the Middle East and North Africa. The Soviet Union's anti-imperial rhetoric, however cynically deployed, provided a potent alternative model that challenged Western dominance. Therefore, the sudden disintegration of those five empires was not an isolated event, but a crucial prelude. It drained the moral and psychological reservoir that sustained colonial rule. When the second, even more devastating World War exhausted the European powers physically and financially, the stage was already set. The colonized world had spent decades watching imperial prestige crumble, absorbing the language of self-determination and building its own nationalist movements. The post-1945 wave of decolonization, which saw the British, French, Dutch, and Belgian empires recede, was the final, logical consequence. The great vanishing of the early 20th century had already proven that no empire, no matter how ancient or powerful, was immune to the tides of history and the will of its people. That lesson, once learned, could never be unlearned, and it reshaped the entire planet into a world of sovereign states. Yet the word sudden demands a closer look. A building can stand for centuries, its walls slowly weakening until a final tremor brings it down in a single, dusty hour. The collapse is indeed sudden, but the decay was not. So it was with these empires. Their final moments played out at dramatically different speeds, a stark contrast between explosive rupture and protracted dissolution. On one end of the spectrum, the Russian and German empires fell with the shocking force of a detonation. The Romanov dynasty's authority evaporated in just a few days during the February Revolution of 1917. The German Kaiser's reign ended in a matter of weeks during the November Revolution of 1918. These were rapid, violent transfers of power where the old regime was not just voted out, but physically overthrown, its symbols torn down and its leaders forced to flee. The collapse was a discrete, explosive event. On the opposite end, the ends of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were processes, not events. The Habsburg monarchy did not explode, it dissolved. Over the autumn of 1918, its various national components simply walked away, declaring independence in a sequence that felt more like a quiet legal separation than a dramatic revolution. There was no single battle for Vienna, no storming of the Hofburg Palace. Emperor Karl did not so much abdicate as acknowledge a reality that had already materialized around him. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire's end was a long, agonizing decade of war, from the Balkan Wars through the First World War and into the Turkish War of Independence. Its sovereignty eroded piece by piece, its final legal abolition in 1922 coming only after years of brutal conflict and a successful nationalist rebellion that created something entirely new from its core. Somewhere in between sat the Qing dynasty. Its formal abdication in 1912 was a swift political act, but it was the culmination of a 70-year crisis, a slow-motion unraveling that began with the Opium Wars. The collapse was revolutionary and internal, focused on overthrowing a dynasty seen as foreign and ineffective, but it did not immediately create a stable new state, instead unleashing decades of warlordism and civil war. This comparative view reveals a crucial distinction historians often make between decline and collapse. Decline is the long, slow accumulation of weaknesses, fiscal strain, social discontent, military obsolescence, and ideological decay. All five of these empires were in profound decline by the dawn of the 20th century. Collapse, however, is the rapid loss of political control. The moment the central authority can no longer command obedience. That moment arrived for all of them within a single, concentrated human lifetime, between the Qing abdication in 1912 and the formal end of the Ottoman Sultanate in 1922. The timeline is startling in its compression. In just over a decade, the political face of Eurasia was remade. This compression is why the event feels so sudden, so world-altering. A person born in 1890 could have witnessed the height of all 5 empires as a young adult, and by their early 40s seen every single one vanish. The final trigger was almost always the immense, concentrated pressure of total war, which acted like a hydraulic press on structures already riddled with cracks. For Russia and Germany, the press broke them instantly. For the others, it slowly squeezed them out of existence. The lesson here is in historical causality. The collapse was the event, but the decline was the condition. The event was sudden, but the path to it was long and paved with choices, failures, and ignored warnings. It forces us to ask a difficult question about our own world. What slow declines are we living through now? And what single, concentrated pressure might turn them into a sudden, irreversible collapse tomorrow? The treaties signed in Paris and Lausanne spoke of sovereignty and borders, but in the train stations and dusty roads of Eurasia, a different story was being written in real time. It was a story of suitcases tied with rope, of families huddled on crowded platforms, and of children asking where home was now. For every new line drawn on a map, there were countless lives it cut directly in half. This was the human aftershock of imperial collapse, a tide of displacement and identity crisis that reshaped the demographic landscape of the 20th century. Consider the scale for a moment. Historians estimate that in the decade following the Great War, between 5 and 10 million people became refugees or were forcibly resettled across Europe and the Near East. These were not just numbers, they were teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, and grandmothers whose entire sense of belonging was erased overnight. A Greek family that had lived for 3 centuries in a coastal town of Anatolia suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of a new, fiercely nationalistic Turkish border. The subsequent compulsory population exchange, a diplomatic solution meant to ensure ethnic homogeneity, saw over 1 million Greek Orthodox Christians from Turkey and nearly 400,000 Muslims from Greece forcibly relocated, their properties left behind. They traveled on crowded ships and trains carrying what they could, arriving in a homeland many had never seen, speaking a language that now felt foreign. The violence that often accompanied these transitions left deep scars. In the shattered remains of the Russian Empire, the Civil War created a landscape of famine and flight. A peasant family from the Volga region, caught between the Red and White armies, might flee eastward into Siberia with nothing but a cart and a few sacks of grain, becoming internal refugees in a state that was collapsing in on itself. Archival letters from the period speak of a pervasive sense of loss and disorientation. One such testimony, from a teacher who fled Petrograd, describes the feeling of being a ghost in your own life, watching the world you knew dissolve into chaos, with no authority left to appeal to for protection or guidance. Beyond physical displacement was a more subtle, profound crisis, the crisis of identity. A German-speaking clerk in the beautiful city of Prague went to bed a subject of Emperor Karl in Vienna and woke up a citizen of the new Czechoslovakia. Was he still who he was yesterday? His loyalty, his language, even his daily routines were now political statements in a nation defining itself against its former rulers. Similarly, an Armenian survivor of the terrible hardships of the war years might find themselves in Damascus or Beirut, a permanent exile from a homeland that no longer existed on any official map. Their personal history became a fragile, invisible country they carried within them. This human dimension forces us to reframe our understanding of historical change. We so often study the grand narratives, the treaties and the battles, the speeches and the revolutions, but history, at its core, is the accumulation of individual experiences. What did the fall of an empire mean for the baker who could no longer get flour because the imperial supply lines were severed? What did a new border mean for the farmer whose field was now split between two hostile nations? These collapses were not abstract political events. They were a daily reality of hunger, fear, and heartbreaking choice. When we reduce this period to shifting borders and ideological contests, we miss its true gravity. The collapse of these five empires was a seismic event that fractured millions of personal worlds. It asked ordinary people to pay the dearest price for grand historical transformations they never asked for. Their resilience, their journeys, and their silenced stories are the essential counter-narrative to the diplomatic record. They remind us that the end of an age is not measured in signed documents, but in the quiet, enduring struggle to rebuild a sense of home from the pieces left behind. And as these scattered populations sought new beginnings, the nations that received them faced their own profound test, a struggle to define what it meant to belong in a world where the old certainties had vanished forever. History is not a force of nature, but a story written by human hands. A persistent myth surrounds these five great collapses, the idea that they were somehow inevitable, that these empires were doomed from the start, and their fall was a preordained conclusion in a grand historical script. This deterministic view is comforting. It simplifies the chaos and absolves the actors of their choices, but it is also dangerously misleading. To accept inevitability is to rob history of its most vital lesson, that at every turn, different decisions could have led to a radically different world. The truth is far more compelling and far more relevant to our own time. These empires did not collapse because of some unstoppable law of history. They collapsed because of a specific, combustible mixture of long-term pressures and short-term, contingent choices, with the First World War acting as the ultimate catalyst. To see this, we must engage in a little counterfactual thinking, not as fantasy, but as a serious historical tool to highlight the pivotal moments where the future was truly up for grabs. Consider the Qing dynasty. By the late 19th century, a vigorous reform movement was underway, known as the self-strengthening movement. Officials were building modern arsenals, steamship companies, and telegraph lines. What if these efforts had begun just one generation earlier, before the Opium Wars shattered China's confidence and drained its treasury? What if the conservative faction at court, which saw any change as a betrayal of tradition, had been sidelined in favor of those who understood the scale of the technological revolution? A China that modernized its military and economy on its own terms in the 1840s, rather than being forced to in the 1890s, might have entered the 20th century as a consolidated constitutional monarchy like Japan, rather than a hollow shell ripe for revolution. The collapse was not written in the stars. It was written in a series of delayed and half-hearted reforms. Now, look to Russia. The pressures of industrialization and social discontent were immense, but the Tsarist regime was not without options. After the revolution of 1905, Nicholas II was forced to create a national parliament, the Duma. For a brief moment, Russia had a fragile pathway toward a constitutional monarchy. But the Tsar, clinging to his autocratic divine right, repeatedly dismissed the Duma and rolled back its powers. He chose repression over reconciliation. What if a different Romanov or a different set of advisors had embraced this shift? What if Russia had stayed out of the catastrophic conflict of 1914, focusing instead on internal development and managing its social tensions? A Russia that evolved gradually, avoiding the totalizing pressure cooker of World War, might have experienced a transformation, not an obliteration. The Bolshevik seizure of power was a spectacular contingency, not a certainty. The case of Austria-Hungary is perhaps the most poignant. The empire's fatal flaw was its inability to satisfy the national aspirations of its Slavic peoples. But what if the Habsburg leadership had seen federalism not as a threat, but as the only salvation? Proposals existed to transform the dual monarchy into a triple or even a federal monarchy, granting Czechs, Poles, and South Slavs genuine autonomy within a broader economic and defensive union. Emperor Karl I actually considered such plans during the war, but it was too late. The momentum for complete independence was already unstoppable. Had this restructuring been attempted in the peace of the 1880s or 90s, the empire might have reinvented itself as a voluntary association of nations, a United States of Central Europe, providing stability in a volatile region. Its peaceful dissolution suggests its peoples were not inherently bent on destruction, but on self-rule, a need the archaic structure could no longer accommodate. This perspective is championed by historians like Niall Ferguson, who emphasizes the role of contingency, the idea that history turns on unpredictable events and individual decisions. In his work on the First World War, he argues that the conflict itself was far from inevitable, hinging on a handful of key choices in the summer of 1914. He writes that we must resist the teleological fallacy, the notion that events have a predetermined destination. The fall of these empires looks inevitable only in hindsight, from our point in time where we know how the story ended. But for the people living through it, the future was a fog of possibilities. A single assassination in Sarajevo, a different telegram from Berlin, a more flexible monarch in Vienna, any of these could have altered the trajectory. The long-term pressures were real: economic strain, rising nationalism, social inequality. These were the dry tinder, but it took the specific, concentrated spark of World War, itself a product of contingent alliances and miscalculations, to set it all ablaze. The war was the great accelerator and the great simplifier. It forced every latent contradiction to the surface and demanded a final, brutal resolution. Without that war, the pressures would have continued, but they might have been managed, negotiated, or channeled into evolution rather than revolution. The collapse was a possibility that became a reality through a unique convergence of bad decisions, missed opportunities, and catastrophic luck. This is why studying these collapses matters so profoundly for us today. It empowers us. If history is merely a pre-written script of rise and fall, then we are just passive audience members, watching civilizations march toward their destined end. But if history is a landscape of choices and chances, then our present moment is equally open. The challenges we face, geopolitical, economic, environmental, are not inevitabilities. They are the product of decisions being made right now. The great vanishing of the early 20th century teaches us that no institution, no matter how grand or ancient, is immune to the consequences of poor leadership, rigid thinking, and a failure to adapt. But it also teaches us that collapse is not the only possible outcome. Reform, renewal, and resilience are just as much a part of the historical record. The past was not fixed, and neither is the future. The story of these 5 empires is ultimately a warning about the fragility of complex systems, and a reminder that human agency, for better or for worse, is the engine of change. A historian sifting through the archives is not so different from a physician reviewing a patient's chart. They are both looking for vital signs, subtle symptoms that reveal the underlying health of a complex system. When examining the final decades of a great empire, scholars have identified a consistent set of diagnostic criteria, a checklist of decline that appears again and again. By understanding these indicators, we move beyond simply listing events and begin to diagnose the cause of death. The first and most critical vital sign is fiscal health. An empire is an expensive machine requiring constant revenue to pay soldiers, maintain infrastructure, and support the ruling elite. historians look for a state living beyond its means. This could be massive foreign debt, like the Ottoman Empire's crippling loans to European banks, which surrendered its economic sovereignty. It could be rampant inflation, as seen in late Tsarist Russia, where printing money to fund the war made the ruble nearly worthless, destroying public trust. Or it could be an archaic tax system that fails to tap into new wealth, leaving the Qing dynasty unable to fund a modern military while local elites grew rich. When an empire can no longer pay its bills, every other function begins to fail. Closely linked is the symptom of military overstretch. This is not merely having a large army, but one that is perpetually engaged, draining resources without providing lasting security. The German Empire, for instance, by 1914, found its formidable army trapped in a two-front war it could not sustain. The Romanovs faced the same in the East and West. Overstretch means defending borders so vast that any conflict becomes a logistical nightmare, and every rebellion in a distant province requires a costly campaign that weakens the core. It is the sign of an empire that has expanded beyond its capacity to control and integrate what it has conquered. Perhaps the most telling internal symptom is the loss of elite cohesion. An empire is held together not just by armies, but by a network of aristocrats, bureaucrats, and regional leaders who believe their future is tied to the central state. When that belief fractures, collapse accelerates. In Austria-Hungary, the Hungarian nobility constantly bargained for more autonomy, weakening Vienna's authority. In the final years of the Qing, regional governors and military commanders began ignoring orders from Beijing, effectively running their own domains. This elite fragmentation is a silent cancer, where the very people tasked with upholding the system start preparing for its end, hedging their bets or plotting alternatives. Directly tied to this is the fourth diagnostic, the erosion of popular legitimacy. Why do millions obey a distant emperor? The answer is a mixture of tradition, fear, and perceived benefit. When that benefit disappears, so does loyalty. Historians measure this by tracking internal rebellions, not as isolated events, but for their frequency, scale, and the social groups involved. The Boxer Rebellion was a catastrophic blow to Qing legitimacy because it revealed the court's desperation and incompetence. The bread riots in Petrograd were not just about hunger, they were a final, furious verdict on the Tsar's right to rule. Legitimacy evaporates when the state can no longer provide basic security or justice, and when new ideologies like nationalism offer a more compelling story of belonging. Finally, experts assess a state's adaptive capacity. Can it integrate new technologies and ideas, or does it resist change until it is too late? This is where you see a stark divergence. Germany rapidly industrialized but failed to adapt its autocratic political structure to a newly empowered urban working class. The Ottoman Empire adopted modern rifles and telegraphs, but could not reform its theocratic foundation to satisfy the nationalist aspirations of its subjects. A failure to adapt is often a failure of imagination at the very top, a rigid commitment to the source of past success that becomes the cause of future failure. Applying this diagnostic framework to our five empires reveals a chilling consistency. Each one, by the early 1900s, was showing critical readings in multiple categories. They were fiscally strained, militarily overcommitted, politically fractured, and losing the faith of their people. The First World War was not the disease, it was the extreme stress test that revealed every hidden weakness at once, pushing already failing systems into total failure. This historical toolkit does more than explain the past, it gives us a language to observe the present. The vital signs of an empire are, in essence, the vital signs of any complex political system. By learning to recognize them, we move from passive observers of history to more thoughtful readers of our own time. The echoes of that vanished world are not silent. They reverberate in the questions we ask about our own. History never repeats itself exactly, but patterns have a way of resonating across centuries, like a deep chord struck in one era and heard faintly in the next. So let us engage in a quiet thought exercise, not to draw simplistic parallels, but to listen for those echoes. What does it mean to govern a vast, interconnected, and diverse population in an age of rapid change? How does any political structure maintain legitimacy when the ground beneath it is constantly shifting? The empires of the past grappled with these eternal puzzles, and the contours of their struggle can still inform our understanding of complexity itself. Their central challenge was integration. How do you bind together people of different languages, faiths, and traditions into a cohesive whole that feels stable and just? They tried dynastic loyalty, religious authority, and military force. Today, the binding agents might be different: economic interdependence, digital networks, or shared civic ideals. Yet the fundamental tension remains the same: the pull between unifying forces and the powerful desire for local identity and self-determination. It is a balancing act on a global scale. Then there is the relentless pressure of technological disruption. For the Qing and the Ottomans, it was the steamship and the telegraph, arriving from outside and rewriting the rules of commerce and communication faster than their institutions could adapt. Today, we live within our own continuous revolution, where artificial intelligence and instantaneous global information flows reshape economies and societies in real time. The pressure is not on adopting a single new tool, but on the capacity of any system to continually learn, reform, and distribute the benefits of change before discontent overwhelms it. This connects directly to the economic question: the management of strain and inequality. Those empires buckled under the weight of debt, the stress of financing modernity, and the visible gulf between a prosperous elite and a struggling populace. When the economic promise of a system is perceived to be broken, when the pathways to a better life seem blocked, the social contract phrase, it is a universal signal, a vital sign of systemic health that transcends any particular century. And what of the information environment? The printing press and the newspaper turbocharged nationalism in the 19th century, allowing new, imagined communities to form. Today, our digital landscapes can unite or divide, can enlighten or mislead, at a speed and scale those earlier revolutionaries could scarcely dream of. The control of narrative, the battle for hearts and minds, has always been a cornerstone of political power. When the story a state tells about itself no longer matches the lived experience of its people, a crisis of legitimacy begins. This is not about predicting any specific outcome, but about recognizing the nature of the pressures. The empires of the early 20th century were rigid structures in a fluid world. They could not bend, so they broke. The ultimate lesson, then, may not be a list of doomed traits, but a meditation on resilience. What does it mean for a political community to be agile, to listen to its constituents, to reform its institutions before crisis forces its hand, and to foster a shared sense of belonging that is stronger than the forces pulling it apart? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are the essential questions of governance in any era. By studying how 5 great experiments in complex rule came to an end, we are not reading an obituary for the past. We are studying the fundamental physics of political systems, the timeless stresses of scale, change, and human aspiration. The specific empires are gone, but the puzzles they faced are very much alive. The streets of Berlin in the 1920s felt like a laboratory for a new kind of human. In the shadow of the vanished Hohenzollern Palace, artists, writers, and architects were not just creating new work, they were trying to build a new reality from the rubble of the old one. This was the cultural and artistic response to the Great Collapse, a seismic shift in human expression that we now call modernism. When the stable, ordered world of emperors and empires disintegrated, so too did the artistic rules that had mirrored that world for centuries. The result was a creative explosion that both documented the trauma and desperately sought a path forward. In literature, the old, omniscient narrator who understood the world gave way to voices of profound confusion and alienation. In Prague, which had so recently been part of the vanished Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Kafka wrote stories that felt like nightmares of logic. His characters, like Joseph K. in The Trial, find themselves trapped in endless, incomprehensible bureaucracies, accused of crimes they do not understand by authorities they can never reach. This was not fantasy, it was a direct reflection of the individual's new, terrifying reality, adrift in a world where the old authorities were gone, replaced by faceless, impersonal systems. In poetry, T.S. Eliot's 1922 masterpiece, The Wasteland, became the defining lament for a shattered civilization. Its fragmented lines, jumping between different voices and ancient languages, captured the feeling of a world where all the old connections, spiritual and cultural, had been severed. The poem opens with a famous declaration of barrenness, calling April the cruelest month, and moves through a landscape of spiritual emptiness. It was an artistic mirror held up to the post-war condition, a global sense of loss and rootlessness. Visual art underwent a similar fracture. For centuries, painting had sought to represent the world as a coherent, perspectival space. But after the collapse, how could you paint a stable world when none existed? Artists like Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque answered with Cubism, breaking the human form and the still life into geometric fragments, showing multiple viewpoints at once. It was as if the solidity of the object itself had been shattered, just like the solidity of Imperial Europe. In Germany, the Bauhaus school, founded in Weimar in 1919, took this fragmentation and tried to reassemble it into something functional and beautiful for the new age. Its founder, Walter Gropius, proclaimed a radical unity of art, craft, and technology. A Bauhaus building or chair was stripped of all imperial ornament, becoming pure, clean, geometric form. This was not mere design, it was a moral and political statement, an attempt to use clarity and function to build a better, more rational society from the ground up. Even music transformed, turning away from the grand, sweeping romantic compositions that had scored the imperial age. In Vienna, the same city where Johann Strauss waltzes had once symbolized Habsburg elegance, Arnold Schoenberg was dismantling traditional harmony itself. He developed the 12-tone technique, a system that abandoned the familiar hierarchy of notes, creating music that felt unsettling, unresolved, and profoundly modern. It was the sound of a world without a central key, without a home note, mirroring the political world without a central emperor. Meanwhile, in the new Republic of Turkey, the cultural project was not about expressing anxiety, but about forging a new national identity. The state actively promoted a new genre of music, blending simplified folk melodies from Anatolia with Western harmonies, creating an art form that was deliberately modern, secular, and Turkish. This was culture as nation-building, a tool to consciously distance the new citizen from the Ottoman past and orient them toward a unified future. These artistic movements, from the despair of Kafka to the hopeful geometry of the Bauhaus, were not mere reactions. They were active participants in making sense of the unimaginable. When the external structures of empire vanished, artists turned inward, exploring the fragmented psyche, or outward, trying to blueprint a new utopia. Culture became the arena where the deepest questions of the age were asked, where the loss of old meanings was mourned, and where new ones were tentatively, bravely proposed. This creative ferment was a testament to a profound truth, that when a society's political foundations crumble, the shockwaves travel through every layer of human expression, forcing a reimagining of what it means to be, to see, and to create. And as artists mapped this new emotional landscape, another, more tangible legacy of the collapse was taking shape, one etched not on canvas but directly onto the earth and the lives of millions. He was born Franz Huber in a modest apartment near the Danube in the spring of 1880. For the first 34 years of his life, his world had a name, a color on the map, and an emperor. He was a subject of His Imperial and Royal Apostolic Majesty, Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, and a dozen other titles that described the sprawling mosaic of the Habsburg realm. Franz's father was a minor postal official, and the path for a diligent boy was clear. He attended a good gymnasium, studied law at the University of Vienna, and by 1905 he had secured a coveted position as a junior civil servant in the Ministry of Finance. His work was meticulous, his loyalty unquestioned. He took pride in the orderly function of the empire, in the stamps bearing the emperor's profile, in the sense that his small, precise role helped sustain a centuries-old civilization. He married a girl from a similar family. They had 2 children, and they took summer holidays in the Salzkammergut Lake district, a landscape that felt eternally, peacefully Austrian. Then, in the summer of 1914, the summons came. Franz Huber, now 34, was conscripted as a lieutenant in the Imperial and Royal Army. He was not a natural soldier, but he was a patriot. He believed he was defending his emperor, his family, and the delicate order of Central Europe from external threats. He was assigned to a regiment with men from across the empire, Czechs, Hungarians, Poles. In the trenches of the Eastern Front, the abstract idea of imperial brotherhood was tested by mud, fear, and a shared longing for home. He wrote letters to his wife about the strange beauty of the Carpathian Mountains and the bone-deep cold. He also wrote in careful, coded language of the confusion. Why were they fighting the Russians alongside the Germans? Why did the Hungarian units seem to receive better supplies? The grand imperial machine, so smooth in the ministry offices in Vienna, was grinding itself into dust in the field. In 1916, a piece of shrapnel wounded his leg. He was invalided out, returning to a Vienna that was grayer, hungrier, and filled with whispers. He went back to his desk at the ministry, but the work had changed. It was no longer about managing an empire's wealth, but about rationing its scarcity, about printing money to fund a war that was clearly being lost. The autumn of 1918 arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, bewildering evaporation. One day, France was drafting a memo on emergency grain allocations for Bohemia. The next, the officials around him were speaking of things called national councils. The Czechs had left, the Hungarians had left, the telegrams from the provinces stopped coming to the ministry altogether. He attended a meeting where a senior official, his voice trembling, simply told the staff to go home, that the ministry's authority no longer extended beyond the city's ring road. Emperor Karl had issued a strange proclamation that was not quite an abdication. The army, the very institution France had served, had simply dissolved, its soldiers walking back to their newly declared homelands. In a matter of weeks, Franz Huber went from being an official of a global empire to an unemployed citizen of a small, shivering republic that called itself German Austria, a nation that had not existed a month before and had no idea how to feed its people. The passport was the first concrete shock. His old document, a heavy, ornate booklet stamped with the double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs, was now a worthless piece of history. The new one, issued by the Republic of Austria, was a flimsy thing. Under nationality, it said simply Austrian. But what did that mean? For his entire life, Austrian had meant a ruler, a dynasty, a vast domain. Now it meant a small, landlocked country of 6 million people, many of whom saw themselves as Germans who had been unfairly separated from their true nation. His professional identity was equally shattered. The meticulous knowledge of imperial tax codes was obsolete. The network of colleagues across Prague, Budapest, and Zagreb was now a network of foreigners. To support his family, he took a job as a clerk for a struggling import firm. his imperial pension rendered nearly worthless by hyperinflation. He would watch his children, who had been taught hymns to the emperor in school, now sing different anthems and draw maps with strange new borders. Franz's personal journey mirrors millions of others. He did not experience violent revolution but a profound disorientation. His loyalty, once given automatically to a throne, now had nowhere to go. The new republic was unstable, riven by political strife between socialists and conservatives. He felt no passionate nationalism for this new, shrunken Austria, only a deep nostalgia for the lost order and anxiety about the uncertain future. He became, in essence, a man between worlds, carrying the habits and memories of a vanished civilization into a new and untested era. His story contains no great heroism or tragedy, only the quiet, persistent work of adaptation. He learned the new political vocabulary. He voted in Republican elections with a sense of duty rather than passion, and he taught his children to be pragmatic, to secure skills that would be useful in an unpredictable world. Franz Huber's life illustrates the most intimate layer of historical change. The collapse of an empire is measured in treaties and battles, but it is lived in the reissuing of a passport, the retraining for a new career, and the slow, personal recalibration of what home and belonging mean. His survival was not about triumph, but about the human capacity to endure the rewriting of one's own life story by forces beyond any individual's control. While ordinary people like Franz navigated this new world, the very ground of knowledge itself was also shifting, as the academic disciplines we rely on to understand the past were being forged in the fires of this same collapse. The story of these empires is not a closed book resting on a library shelf, but an archive with its lights still on, where scholars lean over documents, debating what they truly mean. For every grand narrative of collapse, there are counter-narratives, competing interpretations that keep the past vibrantly alive and contested. Take the fate of the Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe. One school of thought, often called the decline thesis, argues the empire was doomed by internal rot long before the First World War. Proponents point to a sclerotic bureaucracy, a failure to industrialize at the pace of its European rivals, and the deep-seated tension between a centralizing state and the diverse religious and ethnic communities within its borders. From this view, the war was merely the final, decisive push on a structure already leaning at a dangerous angle, but other historians push back vigorously. They argue this decline narrative is itself a product of European bias, a story told by the empires that ultimately carved up Ottoman lands. Scholars like Ehud R. Toledano suggest we look at the Ottoman 19th century not as a long defeat, but as a period of remarkable transformation and resilience. They highlight the sweeping reforms known as the Tanzimat, which modernized legal codes, education, and the military. They point to a vibrant Ottoman civil society and a dynamic press. From this perspective, the empire was not an ancient corpse, but a complex organism adapting to survive. Its end, then, was not inevitable decay, but the catastrophic result of specific contingent events, primarily choosing the losing side in a world war and facing a coordinated Allied assault intent on its destruction. This debate forces us to ask, where does the balance lie between long-term weakness and short-term catastrophe? The answer is never simple. A similarly profound debate swirls around the Russian Empire and the revolution that consumed it. For decades, the dominant historical view in the West framed the Bolshevik takeover as the inevitable result of Tsarist oppression and economic backwardness. The regime was so rigid, the social inequalities so severe, that a volcanic eruption was the only possible outcome. Yet, more recent scholarship has complicated this picture. Historians like Stephen Kotkin have meticulously detailed the astonishing speed of Russia's industrialization in the decades before 1914, creating not just a proletariat, but also a growing professional class and a more complex society. The question then becomes, could this modernization have led to a different political evolution? Some historians now argue that Russia was on a path toward a form of constitutional monarchy or a more representative government, however haltingly. The revolution of 1905 had forced the creation of the Duma, a national parliament. What if the Great War had never happened? What if Tsar Nicholas had possessed the political wisdom to genuinely share power with these emerging forces? The revolution of 1917 begins to look less like an inevitable historical force and more like a contingent tragedy, a possibility that became reality through the unparalleled stress of total war and a series of disastrous leadership decisions. This shift in interpretation does not excuse the Tsarist regime's failures, but it does remind us that historical outcomes are not preordained. They are the result of a collision between deep structures and fleeting, decisive moments. Personal responsibility sits at the heart of another enduring controversy: the role of Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany's path to war and collapse. The classic, almost cartoonish portrayal is of the bellicose, saber-rattling monarch, whose erratic diplomacy and hunger for world power destabilized Europe and drove his nation into a catastrophic conflict. His infamous dismissal of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the architect of German stability, is often seen as the first act of a reckless reign. But is it fair to place so much weight on one man's personality? A different school of thought, associated with historians like Fritz Fischer and later Christopher Clark, looks beyond the palace at the broader structures of German society. They examine the powerful military establishment, the influential industrialists who stood to gain from arms production, and the pervasive nationalist culture that saw war as a test of national vitality. From this vantage point, Wilhelm was less a singular driver and more a symbol and an enabler, a monarch who reflected and amplified the aggressive ambitions of the powerful elites around him. He was the man at the wheel, but the car itself was built for speed and had many eager passengers. This debate touches on a fundamental question of history: how much do individuals matter versus the impersonal forces of economics, social pressure, and institutional momentum? The answer likely lies in a tense combination, where a flawed leader's choices can unlock the destructive potential already present within a system. These are not just academic quarrels. They shape how we understand causality, blame, and the very nature of historical change. Each new generation of historians, armed with fresh sources or new methodological tools, revisits these collapses, asking different questions. The opening of Soviet archives after 1991 revolutionized the study of the Russian Revolution, providing ground-level views that challenged top-down ideological narratives. The ongoing digitization of newspapers, personal letters, and economic records from the Ottoman world is slowly giving voice to perspectives long overshadowed by the stories of diplomats and generals. History, in this light, is not a static list of facts to be memorized, but a dynamic, evolving conversation. It is a process of continuous interpretation, where our understanding of the past is constantly being refined, challenged, and rewritten. This means the story of the Great Vanishing is not finished. It is still being composed, letter by letter, in archives and universities around the world, a testament to the enduring power and mystery of these five fallen worlds. The borders drawn a century ago are not just lines on a map. They are historical fault lines, and when pressure builds, the ground still trembles. The sudden collapse of those five empires did not end with the last abdication or the final peace treaty. It set in motion chains of cause and effect that stretched directly into the geopolitical headlines of our own time. To understand the deep roots of many contemporary conflicts, we must look back to the world forged in the 1920s, a world built on the rubble of vanished thrones. The most visible legacy is in the very shape of nations. The modern Republic of Turkey is a direct successor state born from the defiant rejection of the Treaty of Sevres and the Ottoman Empire's partition. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's fierce war of independence literally drew the borders that define Turkey today, and the nation's foundational ideology of secular, centralized nationalism continues to shape its domestic politics and its complex role between Europe and the Middle East. This was not a simple change of government, but the conscious creation of a new political entity from the core of an old one, an event that permanently altered the strategic landscape of an entire region. Similarly, the Russian Federation, though no longer an empire or a communist state, still operates within a consciousness shaped by the vast space of the Tsarist realm. Its view of neighboring nations like Ukraine or Georgia is often filtered through a historical lens of shared imperial history and sphere of influence, a perspective that can clash sharply with those nations' own hard-won sense of sovereignty. The collapse of the Russian Empire and the subsequent Cold War did not erase these deep historical connections and tensions, they merely froze them for a time. When the Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991, it thawed many of these same fault lines, leading to conflicts that echo the earlier imperial disintegration. Nowhere are these century-old fault lines more active than in the Middle East. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret pact between Britain and France to divide the Ottoman Arab provinces, is often cited as the original sin of the region's modern borders. While the final borders were adjusted at the peace conferences, the principle of drawing lines to suit colonial interests, often ignoring ethnic, tribal, and religious realities, left a lasting legacy. The creation of states like Iraq and Syria, which combined diverse and sometimes rival groups within arbitrary boundaries, created inherent challenges to governance and national cohesion. The instability that has periodically emerged in these regions is not solely a product of recent history. It is also a consequence of that foundational moment when imperial collapse met great power ambition, crafting states from the top down rather than from societies up. In the Balkans, the peaceful dissolution of Austria-Hungary and the later breakup of the Ottoman Empire created a patchwork of new nations. But the principle of national self-determination proved impossibly messy in such an ethnically intermixed region. The kingdom that became Yugoslavia was an attempt to unite South Slavs, but it papered over deep historical and religious differences between Serbs, Croats, and others. The brutal conflicts of the 1990s, which led to Yugoslavia's own disintegration, were in many ways a violent completion of the unfinished business from 1918. They were a grim demonstration that the nationalist forces which dismantled empires could, decades later, turn inward and dismantle the states those empires left behind. Even the stability of Central Europe today rests upon the settlement that followed the Habsburg collapse. The European Union, in part, can be seen as a grand project to overcome the very volatility and nationalist rivalry that collapse unleashed. By creating shared economic and political structures, it seeks to soften the hard borders and ease the ethnic tensions that have defined the region since the empires vanished. It is a conscious effort to build a new kind of unity, not under a crown but through voluntary agreement, learning from the catastrophic failures of the old order. This long view reveals a crucial insight for understanding international relations today. The headlines about territorial disputes, regional instability, and national identity often have roots that run much deeper than the last election or the latest diplomatic crisis. They are fed by underground streams of history that began flowing when emperors fell and cartographers redrew the world with pens and rulers. The conflicts are modern, with modern actors and technologies, but their frameworks, their borders, and many of their core grievances were established in that pivotal decade of collapse. Studying this great vanishing, therefore, is not an escape into the past. It is a vital tool for deciphering the present. It teaches us that political geography has a long memory, and that the decisions made in moments of revolutionary change can cast shadows for 100 years or more. The world we navigate today was built upon the choices, compromises, and traumas of that era, a reminder that history is never truly over. It is simply waiting for the next chapter to be written. That single, turbulent decade left the world permanently altered. We have journeyed through one of history's most concentrated periods of transformation, witnessing how the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, German, Russian, and Qing empires vanished in little over a decade. Their shared collapse was not a random coincidence, but a powerful convergence of forces that had been building for generations. Nationalism gave people a new story of belonging. Economic strain broke the social contract. The furnace of total war applied unbearable pressure, and at the helm, leaders clung to rigid, wooden-headed notions of power, unable to steer their ancient vessels away from the iceberg. Together, these pressures did not just topple governments, they dismantled an entire world order, the age of multi-ethnic empires ruled by divine right monarchs. In its place rose a volatile new landscape of nation-states, each wrestling with the difficult birth of modern sovereignty. This great vanishing set the direct, unbroken trajectory for the tumultuous century that followed. The ideological clash of the Cold War, the wave of decolonization across Asia and Africa, and even the regional conflicts that still shape headlines today, all have roots tracing back to the decisions made and the borders drawn in the shadow of those fallen thrones. As the historian Margaret Macmillan reminds us, the past is never dead. It is not even past. The echoes of these 5 great collapses are not distant history. They are the deep structural notes in the music of our modern world, reminding us how quickly the familiar can dissolve, and how the choices of one generation become the inherited reality of the next. If you found this exploration of history's pivotal unraveling compelling, please subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that shaped our present. We would love to hear your thoughts, so share which empire's story resonated most with you in the comments below.